Today on CityCast DC, Donald Trump's war on big law has been a big, big political story and a constitutional story everywhere. But in Washington, it is also a local business story. You don't have to spend a whole lot of time walking around downtown to know that the big law firms are a huge employer and a major part of our economy. So what do these ongoing threats from the administration and the legal rulings in favor of the firms who have actually stood up for their rights actually mean for our city? Erin Mulvaney covers national legal affairs for the Wall Street Journal, and she's here to discuss. Today is Monday, March 30th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC's talking about. Erin, welcome.
Thank you.
So you cover national legal affairs for the Wall Street Journal, and that means that over the last year, you have been writing a lot about the Trump administration's battle with big law firms. This has been covered in a lot of places, like a constitutional story, a philosophical story, a story about national power. Here in DC, it's also something of an economic story because a lot of these big firms are big employers here and big players in our economy. So can you just walk back for the uninitiated? The administration has reached huge settlements with some of these firms. Some of them are fighting back. What exactly is happening?
So at the beginning of Trump's term last year, he issued a series of punitive executive orders against law firms. And they were pretty shocking, and they would be devastating to a law firm's business. So as these orders were coming out, obviously the law firms were immediately suing. And then there was kind of an abrupt change when one of the firms settled with Trump, kind of reached this kind of unusual kind of settlement with the government offering some pro bono work. And then several other firms went out of their way to do the same. So there ended up being these two camps of firms fighting and firms that kind of capitulated or settled with the administration to avoid this kind of ire of the president.
What had he, in general, accused these firms of doing, and what was he going to do to them as punishment for that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because it was quite broad what they were accused of. So it was either that they had a connection in some way to a lawyer had worked at the firm at one point who was a rival of the president, or had done work that the president opposed. One of the firms was called out for doing certain pro bono work for transgender rights or for immigrants. And so a lot of it was the root of what lawyers kind of believe they do is represent clients, and just having a lawyer on your team that does that. A lot of these lawyers didn't even work with the firms currently, just to show how loose it was in some cases. But the penalties for most of the executive orders were he stripped security clearances from the lawyers, and they said they couldn't enter federal buildings. And the most important was that the orders directed federal agencies to take all federal contracts from the firms and their clients. And so many of these firms have giant companies that have huge federal contracts. So they'd basically be losing a big portion of their business. For example, one of them was Perkins Coie, and one of their biggest, most original clients was Boeing, which is a huge federal contractor, just to give an idea, or Amazon and Microsoft, just a bunch of companies that it was impossible, basically, to go on with that order against them.
Perkins Coie fought back, and there has been news more recently where it appeared that the law firms had won and the Trump administration was going to back down, and then maybe not. Where does that stand right now?
Yeah, so over last year, for the firms that were fighting, there were 4 firms that were fighting, just to lay it out. 4 firms, and they won 4 separate judges in federal courts said, you can't do this, struck down the orders. And so the Trump administration appealed all of those decisions to the DC Circuit Court. And that's kind of impending. Those take a while to come through, kind of just been sitting there. And so what happened recently was the government posted this notice and said they would no longer we're going to pursue the appeal. So they had, their opening brief, some of the documents they have to file to get these appeals running, due at the end of that week. And they said, no, you know what? We're just not going to do it. And then that was written about, that happened. And the next morning, these firms got notice that they were reversing that decision and were, in fact, going to pursue the appeal. So for us as reporters, we were a bunch of whiplash,
Right, right.
It was like, oh, is this the end of it finally? And then I was just shocked when I found out that it was immediately being reversed. So we found out later that I think when President Trump read these headlines, he said, I didn't sign off on giving up on that fight. And I think they're moving forward. There were going to be arguments in May. So I guess the DC Circuit said they had the right to continue with their appeal. So that's what's happening. It was a little bit of a strange back and forth that's very unusual for these appeals courts.
As a certified taco lover, I am very excited for this. District Bridge's Torre del Taco returns to DC for its 4th year. Here's how it works. From April 1st to April 30th, food lovers like me can earn points by exploring local taco and pupusa restaurants and supporting small businesses. Complete challenges in the free online game to score points and win the ultimate title of DC's Taconasaur. And new this year, in-person taco crawls in Columbia Heights, Mount Pleasant, Cleveland Park, and 14th Street, where you get to vote on your favorite and be entered to win cool swag. Sign up for free and start earning points today at districtbridges.org/Torre del Taco.
Don't miss Folger's Theaters As You Like It, playing now through April 19th at the Folger Shakespeare Library. Envisioned by artistic director Karen Ann Daniels and directed by Timothy Douglas, this vibrant production is a love note to DC with the Forest of Arden evoking the vibes, culture, and character of some of the district's favorite spaces. Featuring choreography from Tony Thomas of Folger Theater's Helen Hayes Award-winning production of Metamorphoses, and original music by Grammy Award nominee Kokai, don't miss this take on Shakespeare's playful and musical comedy. Tickets start at $20 and can be purchased online at folger.edu or by phone at 202-544-7077. Get yours today.
As much as I love springtime in DC, it also means allergy season. And as somebody with severe allergies, that means spring in DC can be rough. And did you know that if your windows are not properly installed or insulated, pollen can still make its way into your home, even if your windows are closed? So what better time to replace those busted old windows than Window Nation's The More You Buy, The More You Save sale going on now. You can save up to 50% off all the windows for your home. Window Nation's installation crews will finish the job in 1 day or less, so you can enjoy the rest of summer with minimal disruption. Best of all, they offer a lifetime warranty on all their windows, so you can relax knowing your home is protected far into the future. You better hurry because the sale ends soon. Schedule a fast, free consultation now at windownation.com.
So let's bring it down to the street in DC, or to K Street, as it were. Both the firms that knuckled under, well, they got a lot of flack for not standing up for their rights, and the firms that have fought. Who are these firms in terms of the ones that have big Washington presences, and what is their reputation and relationship with Washington?
Probably every firm that we're talking about here has a pretty sizable Washington presence. They're also some of the largest firms in the world, global law firms that have giant litigation practices, and probably significantly to your question, they, could go up against the government a lot. And probably a lot of the offices in DC in particular might have like an SEC thing, have some kind of, they deal with the federal agencies often. And then also for government agencies, they're often involved in some of the big deal work. I'm in New York, a lot of that's happening, the M&A, will their deal be stopped? So the government's involved in like the core business often of these law firms.
What are the firms that like someone might have heard of?
Paul Weiss was the kind of a pivotal player here because they are the one settling firm that actually had an executive order issued against them. And so the head of that firm at the time, then Chair Brad Karp, actually went to the Oval Office and made a deal. And so following that, it kind of snowballed from there, and firms like Skadden, one of the biggest firms in the world, Kirkland Ellis, Simpson Thatcher, these firms all made deals with the government. There were 9 in total. And depending on how much you know about law firms, I'll just tell you as a law firm reporter, they're the big guys. All the big guns settled. Like the largest firms decided, let's get ahead of this.
And who fought?
Perkins Coie, which is a big firm. And they actually ended up merging last year with another firm. But they have a decent size, they have an impressive DC presence. And Wilmer Hale, same thing. Sussman Godfrey, it's a little bit of a different one. It's it does some plaintiff side work too. It's kind of a boutique litigation firm. They were involved in a lot of the election denial kind of litigation that was specifically noted in their punitive order. There's Wilmer Hale, Perkins Coie, and Jenner and Block, which is also it's pretty known in DC circles. They have really impressive litigation practices. They're really known for their pro bono work. And all of these firms are, at least in my world, they'd be considered the elite, important firms, including in DC.
That's what I was thinking, that even for people who don't follow law firms or aren't attorneys, their names you recognize because they are people who've been involved in pro bono work on immigration cases. So that's a big piece of the community here, and that the people recognize their names, and these are not insignificant employers. Do you know anything about like how many lawyers, law firm lawyers, are there in Washington, and like what the sort of economic weight of them is?
Man, that's a good question. Most of these big firms have presence in Washington. They could have hundreds of lawyers at each of their just Washington office. These are all pretty big companies, basically, if they were a company.
And in a firm, is there like a rough math, like for every lawyer, there's X number of people who aren't lawyers but work for the firm? And
it depends. I mean, usually when we count lawyers, like say the largest one, like Kirkland, there might be thousands of lawyers, but then you need like support staff. So most of them it would be administrative mostly. Like the bulk of a law firm is a lawyer, but mostly it's pretty much the case, because a lot of, the junior lawyers do a lot of work as well. And there are paralegals, which are not lawyers, but they do some legal help. It depends on the firm, to be honest, because it depends how much. If they're a smaller firm, they might not need as much administrative staff. So it might be like 99-1. And a giant conglomerate like Kirkland might have 60-40 or something. But it just depends on the size of the firm.
But clearly, like if you're walking around downtown Washington, or probably downtown many cities, and you're just counting the names on the buildings, a lot of them are the folks you've just mentioned.
Right, exactly.
The other thing I've been obsessed with during this second Trump term is the way some of these sort of radical changes to the federal workforce and other things have been kind of like changed the sort of sense of itself of a lot of powerful institutions. People thought, I'm coming to work for the federal government because I want to do meaningful work, and I believe in it, and there's something noble and pure, and some of these positions are basically being changed to be more like political hacks, and the folks who occupied these positions had a sense of themselves that it was very alien to that and are very disturbed by it. In your reporting, in the culture of some of these places, particularly the ones that knuckled under, what does that do to the day-to-day for the attorneys, and how does that make them feel, and sort of the kind of mission sense that particularly in DC, a lot of even people who work at big private sector law firms have?
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of angst in the legal industry in general about these decisions to settle in particular. And probably worth saying also, the president's actions themselves were concerning, kind of taking the root of the business of law. A lot of people felt concerned about that. Specifically within the settling firms, there were departures last year, some high-profile departures of particularly folks that I think did either openly say, or proof was in their decision to leave, was because they didn't feel comfortable being in a firm that settled. I think that there's also a contingent of people in law firms who kind of see it as a business, and they are making a lot of money. So they saw it a little differently, that they didn't think they could be oppositional to the federal government and support their clients in the best way possible. So that would be the point of view of people who are really adamant about getting these deals on the table. It was a lot louder noise about being opposed to the settling firms. I think they got really beat up in the, at least my legal press world, pretty beat up.
Yeah. And I think that a lot of people's egos were damaged by that because they flatter themselves that I'm here in a noble pursuit. And
Yeah.
it's hard to look that noble. On the other hand, like you said, these are businesses. So is there a kind of a conventional wisdom in the legal industry, or what do you think? If this is like a city like Washington, where law is a big part of the like local yokel economy, what is the state of that industry? And either because of some of these fights with the Trump administration or other things, what does it say for the future of law as a kind of player in an economy?
I have had that question so much just to myself, because there were definitely things that I think, even if Trump lost in court, in many ways he won with the actions he took. I think it's kind of complicated. There was a significant chilling effect of these firms that were willing to help in the hundreds of lawsuits that were against the administration. So in that way, there, he kind of did successfully kind of put a fear in law firms doing their work. What will that mean for the future? It's either an indicator that this is where law firms already were. They were looking more and more like corporations. The bottom line is what's important. That's what's important to them and their clients. Or is a law firm something different? Is it, like you were kind of saying, this different type of profession that's held up? I think a lot of people I've talked to have a lot of optimism that this can pass over. But we'll see. Maybe were here. Maybe these firms were already at a place where that was what was most important and felt like the business was the most important. When you asked where this all started, I would say it also partially started during the first Trump administration, where a lot of these law firms were some of the biggest opponents of the Trump administration policies. And, loud and proud out about it. And then after his presidency ended, big firms were not representing him. They were really shunning him. And he was, in his various trials and times he used lawyers, was not using these big firms. So I think the chilling effect came from they kind of established themselves as enemies of the president in many ways. So I think that stark reversal, that stark change did signal either it did change the legal industry or it represented where we already are.
And I think that the legacy of that first term opposition, and a lot of people in Washington, a lot of people in sort of permanent Washington, even people with some privilege, sort of flattered themselves that, our city stood up for freedom or whatever and felt pretty good about themselves. And I think that also explains some of the shock and the sort of self-loathing that has attached to this like first year and change of the second Trump administration, because the people who positioned themselves as the defenders of the Constitution and public service and stuff haven't acted that way, that sort of abandoned that public posture. On the specific matter of this litigation, what are the next dates coming up that we should watch for?
The next step will be there will be oral argument before the DC Circuit, and all of the 4 cases are combined. So there'll be just one argument about whether these executive orders were constitutional. And as far as the settling firms, they have made commitments of almost $1 billion combined of pro bono work for the administration's causes. I think everyone's really interested to see how that goes.
That seems like a lot of money. I mean, that they're effectively giving, or money they're giving up because they won't be earning it.
Right. Well, it depends. Some of these firms do $100 million in pro bono in 1 year. And, they were indefinite decisions. They were very strange agreements. I kind of feel confident saying that because they were mostly written on Truth Social and didn't have firm outlines. So
Right.
I think that, and what they were things for things like veterans affairs, justice in the legal system, things that I think sometimes firms already thought they were doing with some of their pro bono, like they could fit in those categories. So, and anti-Semitism. And so they already did some of the work, but just the question of what that means if they have to do more for the president than they would have otherwise. Like I said, they're often oppositional to the administration, these law firms, just in the course of their work, not because they're fighting them in some principled way.
So this doesn't necessarily mean that like the local Porsche dealership is going to get less business partners.
I doubt it. I mean, yeah, I think you were asking about DC firms. I think like a lot of people in DC, probably there's kind of a revolving door of Justice Department or like the government agencies that go to these firms and back out. So there is that kind of ethos that you mentioned of like a federal government worker in some ways. Every time I talk to somebody in DC, they kind of often fell a little more to that side of the civic nature of being a lawyer. They make millions of dollars, but there's a civic idea of a law firm, that is an old idea that lawyers used to not even like get money. Now they're some of the richest people, at least in my world and Wall Street, they're richer than bankers now, and so I think it's I wish I had the answer to what's going to happen. I think we'll have to see.
All right. Well, I hope you'll come back and tell us when it does.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
And that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.